Hi there. So, I am a little lazy. I didn't get any projects done, and I'm just going to do this video where I blather on. And first of all, I want to just thank all the people who watch my videos. That is my mother, my brother, and me. So, thank you for watching. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about hierarchies, a complicated subject that, as you will see throughout this long video, that I'm not going to get very far, but I'll at least share some ideas and I'll give you some of my personal thoughts at the end. So let's start by talking about what hierarchy is and give the definition from the Oxford Dictionary. So it defines hierarchy as a system or organization in which people or groups are ranked one above the other according to status or authority. So what do we think about that? How do we feel about that? And I thought about it, and there were probably three different ways of thinking about it, at least that come to mind for me. So the first is hierarchy's bad. I mean, someone has status or authority over someone. I like freedom, which means I don't want someone bossing me around, that they have more authority or status over me. You know, I'm with Tom Paine and the Freedom Fighters. Then on the other extreme is actually hierarchy is very good. The world is a very dangerous place, and we need strong patriarchs to have higher status and authority that will protect us. And of course, the other side again will say, no, those people aren't protectors. Those people are abusers. They are going to be corrupt and use their status and authority to take advantage of the weaker people. And then you have people somewhere in the middle who say, well, hierarchy can be abused and it's not good, but it might be kind of inevitable. And so we have to figure out how to manage or mitigate some of the problems and create checks and balances. So where are we with all this? Well, let's look a little bit at some different anthropology and history and try to see what we can learn, or what I've learned in some different books I've read. So why don't we start with the traditional view, which is from Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, a book published in the late 90s. And he has a chapter called Egalitarianism to Kleptocracy. And he's referencing the four stages of social structure based on population size. So you have band sizes, which are in the dozens, and then you have tribal sizes of cultures or groups, and those are in the hundreds. And then once you get to the thousands, you get to chieftains. And then once you get to the tens of thousands, you get to states. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about the non-traditional view, but let's investigate and discuss this concept first before we move on. And we'll start by talking about hunter-gatherers, who we sort of assume are the longest form of human social structure. Going back into the Stone Age, there remains some groups, such as the Khoisan people, I don't think that's how you pronounce it, in southern Africa, or the people of the Congo rainforest, referred to as pygmies, although that's not a politically correct term, but I've never heard a politically correct term for those groups of people collectively. I know there's like the Twa and other groups that live there anyway. And the Inuit, or people from like the North Arctic, so very remote places where larger colonial forces haven't really been able to get into, and so these people have been able to retain traditional forms of life. And so we'll look at what Richard Leakey's observations were of the Kung people in southern Africa, so that's South Africa, Botswana, Namibia. So the numerical composition of a foraging band, roughly 30 people, has been called one of the magic numbers of hunter-gatherer life. Throughout the world, hunting and gathering people have, as the core of their social and economic life, a band of about this size. It appears to be the optimum combination of adults and children for exploiting the widespread plant and animal foods that hunter-gatherers live on. Fewer than this, and the social structure is weakened. More, and the work effort has to be increased in order to collect enough food for everyone. Glenn Isaac states, "Most of the prehistoric living sites we find are in this rough order of size, until one approaches the Neolithic period. Only when the modes of production change from the basic hunting and gathering system to a more settled agriculture does groups larger than 30 become viable over long periods." And then he continues on. During the wet summer season, from October to May, a small foraging band erect modest temporary camps among the Mungungo nut groves, moving on to new camps every few weeks. The band moves not in a constant and desperate search for food, but because the longer people stay in one place, the further they must walk each day in order to collect food. It is a question of convenience, not of a flight from starvation. The foraging bands at this time of the year are small, having about 6 families in them. At least some of the families are likely to be related to each other, either by blood or by marriage. In the case, the Kung create an extensive network of informal affiliations throughout their neighboring bands. Giving gifts and receiving them, not trading, are essential elements in weaving together the social fabric of Kung life, and relationships within and between bands are complex and close. So, as you can see, that the structure is based on efficiency, and there's a relationship to resources, how people gather resources, how people get resources, and it seems to be an optimal number in this size, at least for the environment that they're in, which is a pretty arid location. And what anthropologists might call immediate return societies, and that is societies where, because they're moving around a lot, they don't have any kind of storage facilities. Obviously, they don't have refrigeration. So they're not storing and holding on to food. So when they get food, they're incentivized to share it immediately. Why? Because if they can't eat it all, then they need to share it with other people. So that way, when those people also obtain food, they will share it with them. It's sort of a system of reciprocity. And in today, where we might have extra resources and we might put them in the stock market or hoard them and hold on to them, in their society, it makes much more sense to invest in your family or your friends, give them gifts, and build these strong reciprocal ties. And this is a form of egalitarianism. This is where things work on consensus, and people, probably because of the pressures to survive, consensus is a lot easier. Where if you have plenty of resources, you might feel less pressure to make concessions and find agreement, work collectively. If you and your family are all thinking about where your meal is going to come the next day, you're all going to be able to find a consensus if that goal and objective is about getting something to eat. But is society, for them at least, constantly just being in these small groups? Well, perhaps not, because depending on the season, the group size changes. So when the dry winter months come, the congregate around permanent water holes in concentrations of hundreds or more of people. This public phase of life is very important. It's a time of intense socializing, large-scale trance dancing and curing, initiations, storytelling, exchanges of gifts, and marriage brokering. This highly valued public phase of Kung life is not without its drawbacks, however. The unusual concentration of people, and unusual, I mean, they do it every year. But okay, this unusual concentration of people inevitably means that people have to do more work. They have to travel farther to collect plant food and find animals to hunt. And with a high density living there often comes personal conflict. As soon as the rains begin, people once again disperse into small bands in the Monungo groves. The bands are, however, not necessarily the same composition as they once were the previous summer. The public phase is an opportunity for people to join with others with whom they would prefer to live, and for tensions and conflicts can be resolved by the splitting up of some bands. So there you have it. We don't have a static, we're all in a band size, and then we go to tribal size, and then chieftain. It's not such a linear progression. We see this seasonal change where people reform and change their group size. And so we don't have a clear depiction, but let's move on to the other classifications of social structure based on size. So you have the tribal size, which is people in the hundreds, and then you have the chieftain size, and that's when you get to the thousands. Now, this one is very important when we're discussing hierarchy, and this is an important distinction because you have a chieftain, and that is someone with more authority and status over other people. What specifically? Well, Diamond talks about how a lot of chieftain societies include when there's sort of the first fruits or certain foods, harvest. The chieftain is the one that eats first. So again, initiating status and a focus on resources and who gets to control those resources. And there is also this idea of a monopoly of violence. Now, this idea or concept was first created, at least in the West, was Max Weber. And it's the idea that you have to have a central authority who creates stability by having a monopoly on violence. So they get to beat up and imprison whoever they want to. And you would think, well, why is that good? Like, you're giving like one person or a small band of people the power to beat up and imprison other people, or, decide, cases of life and death. They also get secret information. Why should they get secret information? And in modern days, we would be talking about, say, the CIA or the military or the police. They have the monopoly of violence. and they have secret information. They know information other people don't know, and that gives them power and control. So why do we accept that? Well, it creates a certain amount of stability. It creates a certain amount of predictability. And as long as you have some sort of moral or balanced, stable people running that system, then hopefully it will be stable and predictable, and people can live pleasant lives. They don't have to worry about some rando trying to steal things. Because, of course, now we're moving more into a settled locations where people are accumulating property, living all together in large groups in the thousands. And then finally, you get to the state level, and that's where you're talking about the tens of thousands. And when you're going this far back, when you talk about the state, it's different than the modern state where we have bureaucracies. The long process of development by Jerry Huff and Robin Greer mentioned briefly, their whole focus of the book is about bureaucracies, but they mentioned briefly the Roman Empire and how it was really just one central authority, and then they would sort of have these different client states throughout their provinces. So it wasn't a large bureaucratic system. It was more of one mob boss going over and having these sort of lesser mob bosses that follow orders throughout, and that's what their empire was. But let's challenge some of these assumptions about that everything just clearly goes to this order. Like, well, there's just more people, and what are we going to do? We need to have this central authority. We need to have this hierarchy. So we'll, of course, talk about The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. And in their conclusion, they respond directly to this. So perhaps the most stubborn misconception we've been tackling has been to deal with scale. It does seem to be received wisdom in many quarters, academic and otherwise, that structures of formation are the inevitable result of population scaling up by orders of magnitude. That is, that a necessary correspondence exists between social and spatial hierarchies. Time and again, we found ourselves confronted with writing which simply assumes that the larger and more densely populated the social group, the more complex the system needed to keep it organized. Complexity, in turn, is still often used as a synonym for hierarchy. Hierarchy, in turn, is used as a euphemism for chains of command, the origins of the state, which mean that as soon as large numbers of people decide to live in one place or join a common project, they must necessarily abandon the second freedom. They have these different ideas of freedom to refuse orders. There's also freedom of movement, but let's stay on track. So to refuse orders and replace it with legal mechanisms for, say, beating or locking up those who don't do as they're told. So they're challenging a lot of these assumptions, and they do a pretty good job at challenging some of these preconceived notions. But I would also recommend a much better YouTube video channel, What is Politics? And they have an extensive extensive videos on analyzing the Dawn of Everything. And as much as Dawn of Everything is good at picking apart some of the assumptions, some of their assumptions are not so good. In fact, they look through some of the sources that they cite, and they're misrepresented. And the main point of what is Politics talks about with Dawn of Everything is that they sort of ignore the material conditions of the situation, and they sort of ascribe everything to it's your choice. of what you want to do. Just create any kind of social structure you want without looking at the material situation. Social structures in a materialistic point of view would be, if you live in the mountains, your system might be different than, say, living on the beach, because there's different resources, the weather's different. The things that you need to live and operate might require different types of tasks and different forms of order, and you might have to organize your society differently because of that. So those things are totally ignored in Dawn of Everything, and I don't want people to think that book is all the answers. And I also read Civilizations, Cultures, Ambition, and Transformation of Nature by Felipe Fernandez Armesto. And he does try to analyze and look at different material conditions. And again, I feel like you're sort of left with nothing. So even if the preconceived notions of what Jared Diamond was talking about with these 4 phases, when you look more and more at all the different points of information, you are kind of left with no clear fulcrum to weigh your or balance your different opposing ideas of how you structure and think about a society, and therefore how you can make sense of what to do or what to make of a hierarchy, and what is the proper and best way to manage large groups of people. So what this all is we're thinking about a system, these systems through a process. And what David Wengrow and David Graeber might say is more of an idea of succession. And there's, of course, different people on different sides of the debate, odd friends. So, the people that believe in predestination or material determinism might agree on some of these processes of ultimate causation, like Karl Marx and John Calvin. But sometimes we just don't have enough information, and that's sort of where I'm sort of left at. But what we are clearly looking at with hierarchy is it's this relationship between people, and it's not clear whether it's how many people, but really the relationship to property. And when you have property and resources, who controls the resources and how it's decided. So that's why people have certain status and authority, because they have certain controls over certain types of resources. I don't know if you've heard the expression, but possession is 9/10 of the law. That's referring to property. And I'm sorry if anyone thinks that, the law should be all about human rights. Maybe it should be, but that's not what the history says. Actually, the book The Last Utopia by Samuel Moyn discusses how society, or how human rights really didn't develop, with the Geneva Convention until the 1970s. And you wouldn't really have to 1961 when the Amnesty International started. So this sort of push, and there was sort of a triangulation between Eastern Europe, Jimmy Carter, and Latin America of what brought about human rights at a global scale. And that we shouldn't be confusing that with national rights. So the rights awarded to French people after the French Revolution, or the Bill of Rights in the United States. So those are national rights, not human rights. And we are still in a long process of having human rights. And we have very long, with states and governments, been very focused on property. So with that said, why don't we talk a little bit about slavery? Now, in the United States, sometimes we tend to think that slavery just has to do with, 1619 and forward. but it is a global system that still exists today. It didn't end in 1865, and even though it's illegal based on the United Nations, we know that there's still forced labor, and it seems to have existed for a very long time, as long as people could round up and control people. So I'm going to read an excerpt about slavery from Against the Grain by James C. Scott. And he has a whole chapter on ancient slavery, and I think that is a very important thing because it's, in my opinion, rather under talked about. Sometimes we talk so much in history about the great men and the great kings and generals and leaders. And to have great men and kings and leaders, you have to have many followers. You need to have many people going along with that. And those people are just as much a part of the story. People that have to put up with the orders of the leaders. So let's talk a little bit. I'm going to read a little excerpt from Scott's book. So, warfare in Mesopotamia's alluvium, beginning in the late Uruk period, that's about 3500 to 3100 BCE, and for the next 2 millennium was not about the conquest of territory, but rather about the assembling of populations at the state's grain core, thanks to the original and meticulous work of Seth Richardson. We know that the vast majority of wars in the alluvium were not those between the larger and well-known urban polities, but rather the petty wars by each of those polities to conquer the smaller, independent communities in its own hinterland, to augment the laboring population and hence its power. Polities aimed to assemble unpacified, scattered people and to take non-state clients into states' orders by both force and persuasion. This process, Richardson notes, is a continuing imperative, inasmuch as states are simultaneously losing their own constituent populations from and to non-state units, though the state might presume to a fine-grained administration of its subjects. It was, in fact, in a constant struggle to compensate for the losses from flight and morality by a largely coercive campaign to corral new subjects from among hitherto untaxed and unregulated populations. The old Babylonian legal codes are preoccupied with escapees and runaways, and the effort to return them to their designated work and residence. So there's this long back and forth between trying to get people into your system and follow the rules, because when you have this pyramid, I mean, who wants to volunteer and say, yeah, I want to be at the bottom. I want to put up with everyone's crap. I want to be the slave. And you can call the shots, right? Because hierarchy is so much better. But Scott continues. Slavery was not invented by the state. Various forms of enslavement, individual and communal, were widely practiced among non-state peoples. For pre-Columbian Latin America, Fernando Santos Granaros has abundantly documented the many forms of communal servitude practiced, many of which persisted along with colonial servitude after the conquest. Slavery, though generally tempered with assimilation and upward mobility, was common among manpower-hungry Native American peoples. So there is this process of back and forth, and how much authority and status is really there. A lot of times, focusing on the great men of history, we look at these ancient monuments of, say, the Neo-Assyrians, and them, they have large monuments of their kings overpowering the smaller people, but we have to wonder about what is the true effectiveness? If you have a big army, you might have the biggest army, but what are the costs associated with that? So I'm going to read another excerpt from The Pursuit of Power by William H. McNeill about Sargon, the first emperor, I guess you could say. The Akkadian Empire is considered the first empire. We could think of it as a state, but what kind of state was it? How did it really operate? So he, of course, had a lot of conquests, this Sargon fellow. So let's read McNeill's excerpt. The career of Sargon of Akkad, who plundered all the land of Mesopotamia around his capital city of Kish about 2250 BC, illustrates the potentialities and limits of organized robbery. A perpetual following of 4,500 men no doubt gave the great conqueror an assured superiority over the local rival. Hence, his 34 victorious campaigns. But to keep such a force in being also requires an annual campaigning, devastating one fertile landscape after another in order to keep the soldiers in victuals, meaning keeping them fed. Costs of population at large were obviously great. So we can think of this as, how this army's organized is probably seems similar to like a plague of locusts coming over the fields of these different areas, and you conquer something, but it's all scorched earth. So there is this relationship, of course, of violence and property, who controls it. We can sometimes think about the market system, about incentives of who control, the supply and demand, but there's always this element of force and this element of someone in power controlling the market system. Who's the security force protecting the market system so people don't cheat other people? And again, going back to hierarchy, why do people put up with this? Obviously, as Scott was saying, people were running away. But there are other ideas. You can have them be dependent on the system, where they might not like the system, but they don't have any other choice because the central authority might control particular resources. So now I'm going to talk about salt. Now, I live in the United States, and people probably have a little bit too much salt in their diet, but we do need salt to live, and there are other places and other times where salt might have been a little more precious. And this is from Salt, A World History by Mark Kalansky. He considers ideas of statecraft around 300 BC in ancient China. So, the Chinese emperor in the Qin dynasty and all his board members are talking about statecraft, and here's the quote. Among the ideas offered by the ministers was fixing the price of salt at a higher level than the purchase price, so that the state could import the salt and sell it for a profit. We can thus take the revenues from what our other states produce. The advisor goes on to point out that in some non-salt producing areas, people are ill from the lack of it, and in their desperation would be willing to pay still higher prices. The conclusion of the Guanzi, that's the source that this is coming from, is that salt has the singularly important power to maintain the basic economy of our state. So yes, if people are dependent on something, you can get them to comply and accept the system if you have something incredibly vital that they need, like salt. But it can also backfire a little bit. And let's talk about the British and their colonization of India. And this is during the 19th century when things are starting to unravel, or the British control of India is starting to dissipate, and largely it's from trying to control these resources. So the local production of salt in India was so successful that Liverpool salt could not compete. So in 1893, the British government closed down the plant. Outperforming British salt was against the rules. And what did this do? This got Gandhi involved and other people, and it did take a good 50 years, but India eventually got their independence. So you can try to make people dependent, but there are breaking points where people will not take it anymore. And here's another example of salt from Global Crisis by Jeffrey Parker. And he's discussing the 1640s in Russia. And they're having tough times, and the Tsar gave a certain person a salt monopoly. And eventually that frustrates the people. So let's read an excerpt from that. Although the Tsar was pleased for moderation, the crowd stormed 3 of his household officials and forced their way into the residence of Nazirai Christie, architect of the hated salt monopoly, and immediately killed him with their axes and clubs, exclaiming, "Traitor! This is for the salt!" Then they hauled him down the stairs by the heels, dragging him like a dog around the interior of the Kremlin, and having stripped him, they flung him stark naked upon a dunghill. So, not good things. As we can see that this whole idea of controlling power can be very precarious, and it's a central point of conflict, especially when times are bad. And people will want to leave. So we can also think about going back to more of a materialistic perspective. We can think about The Decline and Rise of Democracy, which is a book by David Sestasevich. And I liked this book a lot because, unlike a lot of these other books where they're just sort of giving random examples in situations like I'm doing, he went through and categorized and looked at all kinds of different cultures and compared how authoritarian versus democratic they were. And one of his conclusions or hypotheses is that places with more rugged terrain, where you couldn't have a Sargon Akkad marching around, people had to come together through agreement. So that might be ancient Greece, or the Haudenosaunee or Huron of around the Great Lakes in North America, or the foothills of the Himalayas, aka Buddha's hometown, where they had sort of a confederacy or councils. And there's many examples around the world, but there's also authoritarian examples, and those would be flatter areas where you could produce a lot of food and it would be easy for an army to consolidate and hold power. So ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Yellow River in China. And now that I've said all those bad things about hierarchies and how messed up they are and all the problems, you probably already know all this stuff. And you might also know that, hey, what if we just had the mob run around, like a mob of people run around? Is that really that great? Shouldn't we have, aren't there certain people that might know a little better? Like, what if someone has more experience or more merit, so they should handle something? Like, if you had a brain tumor and you needed brain surgery, would you just pick, your best friend, like the person you like the most or the most confident person? Or would you actually pick someone that is trained and understands those things the best? And so now we're getting into talking about meritocracy. And meritocracy, of course, is giving someone a status giving someone more status or authority because they should be more competent in something. And there are 2 books by Benjamin A. Elliman, Civil Examinations and Meritocracy in Late Imperial China, and Cultural History of Civil Examinations in Late Imperial China, that I read that were about the first meritocracy. In fact, meritocracy was learned about by the Jesuits in the West, and they brought it back over to Europe, and it replaced nepotism at a certain point. But one thing you should know is, these civil examination systems where, the Chinese emperor, rather than put his cousin or his best buddy in charge of certain administrative positions, and rather put a administrator based on merit, someone that could pass the test the best, is that people start learning the rules, and rather than say, I'm going to learn the rules the best, they're going to learn how to cheat, or I'm going to bribe the person giving the test. And there's all these ways of, people don't really want the best person, they just want themselves to be there, and so they learn to cheat. And merit is a complicated thing. And of course, someone could be meritorious in certain things, like a doctor, goes through the status of learning medicine, and so they might be very good, very meritorious at curing disease, but they might not be meritorious in, fixing your toilet. You might need a master plumber for that, and they get merit because they have a lot of experience and knowledge in that. So we all have different things that we are good at, and that doesn't mean so that status does not mean everything, like a totalitarian dictator. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is emergencies. So, say you have a forest fire, and everyone in your community is trying to put it out, but no one's working in a coordinated fashion. So it's very inefficient. You can't actually put out the fire. So a leader comes and says, I'm going to tell everyone what to do. And they direct everyone, and the fire is put out. Yay. And of course, doesn't that make sense? But wait a second, that's hierarchical. That's one person telling other people what to do. Well, the whole forest would have burnt on fire. So we needed that, at least momentarily. And in terms of states, oftentimes the emergency is the time when power gets centralized. And decisions can be made quickly. And if the crisis lasts for a very long period of time, people can simply become accustomed to accepting that central authority. And so we have to be very aware of that. So I'm going to now just give a few of my personal thoughts and wrap this up. So I want to just say that, yes, we live in a hierarchical world, and we see all kinds of abuses of people with power, and those things should be in check. We need to work on those things. But it's not enough to just be complacent. It's not enough for me to just sit here alone and talk about these things. It's a process of learning all the time, just like the materialists and all the, whatever the opposite is, the idealists, think how things should be. You have to think about it and how it's applied into the real world. Just like if someone might have a particular ideology, it sounds great on paper, but once they're put in a position of power and they have to implement it, and there's threats of people taking that away, they might quickly abandon that ideology. I think there's plenty of historical examples that I'm not going to cite. I'm not going to cite that, show that. I don't know, Che Guevara comes to mind, or something like that, or other other people, other revolutions where, there's an ideology, and then suddenly the person who was responsible for leading that revolution becomes actually an ideological opponent of it by being cruel and terrible. So there you have it. So we have to think, I think, is how I practice equal relationships within my own life, and even when understanding when there are relationships of when I have to be in charge or when I have to follow orders. And, that's a whole longer video. But in the long term, in the larger structure of things, the most I guess I can hope for is that it's not going to happen in my lifetime. But that doesn't mean that I shouldn't be working towards that, or at least not get in the way of people working towards that. And recognize the contributions that other people are going to do, because if it is going to happen, if we are going to live in better worlds without people being oppressed, people being locked up in prisons, and slavery and wars where people are crushing each other and fighting over property, we need to think very seriously about how we're building other people up, and we're building up our reciprocal bonds with people and passing those on to the future and the next generation, because we're not going to live forever. All right, that's all.